speak about addressing hate, part of addressing hate is addressing ignorance and sharing personal experiences so that people can understand that we're actually all the same. And there's more that unites us than what divides us, and that we would all benefit from a society that is diverse and loving and peaceful. And this was actually said in the De Saab case recently, when it was Friedal's case, when it was before the High Court, where the High Court quoted Professor Dworkin. And Professor Dworkin spoke about how a lot of the ideas that we have is often ideas either resting on false assumptions and assumptions not based on fact, and how that then sort of gets perpetuated throughout society and results in blind hate without us often even knowing why we hate and what's forming the basis of the hate. But hate sort of becoming, it's like if someone yawns and then everyone else started yawning. And hate is a bit like that. It's contagious, which is why we really need to work against it. And it's encouraging that at least at the High Court level, there has been some thought around what hate means and how harmful it is to democracy and to our society. And I'll give you the presentations. You don't have to read everything on your off day. But the main thing is, I think we want to have a campaign across the region where all of us, no matter who we are, consistently say that we don't want hate in our society. So the UN has done quite a number of things around hate speech online and offline, and we'll send you those resources in the chat box. So although we speak about hate broadly today. So when we get to the strategy part at the end of the webinar, I think we want to speak about how do we stop hate in our society. But there is the more specific part of hate speech and of hate crime. So I'll start with hate speech. And it's important to realize that hate speech and freedom of speech are two entirely different things. Now, people say there is a fine line between when does free speech become hate speech? And often they say that that is when someone uses their speech to incite violence. Slightly more complicated than that, and we'll go through that. So there's no universal definition of hate speech, but according to international human rights law, hate speech is prohibited when it leads to incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. That is when hate speech is prohibited. But hate speech itself is actually a broader definition, and it really is about when anyone uses attacks a group or individuals based on discrimination. And what's important there in the UN definition, if you look right at the end, they have various identities upon which people can be targeted, and but they include or any other identity factor. And this is important because one will never be able to list all the identities upon which someone can be discriminated against, and against whom hate speech can be perpetrated. So when we speak about hate speech, we speak about hate speech that's directed at individuals or group of individuals. So we're not speaking about someone complaining about the state or something like that. That falls under different things. So basically, hate speech can take any form of expression, both online and offline. It can include, for example, the swastika would be a symbol of hate. So you don't even need to say something. Sometimes the image itself can evoke that hatred. Hate speech is basically something that is either discriminatory or prejudiced. And it's based on any number of identity factors, which includes disability, health, or sexual orientation. So freedom of speech is protected in the Constitution, not in great length. It just says All persons shall have the right to freedom of speech and expression, which shall include freedom of the press and other media. But that same section says that those rights can be limited on various grounds, including public order, defamation, or if it leads to incitement of offense. So really speech that incites hatred would be hate speech, and one would be allowed to limit that sort of speech. And I want to give an example. In South Africa, there was a constitutional court case specifically relating to a journalist who had engaged in hate speech against the LGBTQ community. And the court said, the court obviously valued freedom of expression and said that a healthy democracy requires a degree of tolerance, even if speech shocks or offends. But hate speech goes beyond that. Hate speech goes beyond merely being offensive. It expresses extreme detestation and vilification that can promote discriminatory activities against a specific group in society. Speech becomes hate speech when it attempts to violate the rights of another person or groups of persons based on their group identity. And since the dignity of the person is protected by the Constitution, hate speech cannot be allowed. And this is where the contradiction really comes in. You'd often find, for example, any sort of limit on free speech would be opposed by the media, obviously because they want to make sure that the media is never caught under such sort of prohibitions. But hate speech should never be allowed. So hate speech cannot be tolerated on the basis of the right to freedom of expression. And we'll go a bit into that. The reason why we're having this webinar is really because we've gotten to a point, and I suppose we've always been there, but it's worse now given what's happening in the US and globally, is where not only is hate speech normalized, it's almost promoted. And we cannot allow it to be normalized. If we don't, all of us, wherever we go, in whatever scenario, speak out against hate and highlight hate, whether it's committed against ourselves or against another group, it doesn't matter. We have to be against hate. So if I am queer, I cannot then at the same time be xenophobic, because we can't say no one can. We must be against all forms of hate. You can't be against homophobia but not against xenophobia, or like we have to be consistent. And whenever we see any hate speech being or hateful acts being committed against any group, we have to speak out. That includes migrants and refugees and people with disabilities and women and a lot of other individuals. Now, there's a ways in which we can try and deal with hate speech. Not many, but there are a handful of them in the laws in Namibia. I think Namibia could do well to look at other countries and how to improve that. And I know that the Ombud in Namibia a few years back had drafted a combating of hate speech bill, and it would be useful to make submissions to Parliament now that they've asked for people to say which laws they want to be prioritized in law reform, to actually call for that also to be prioritized. So the one thing that one could do is you could sue for civil defamation. Now, civil defamation is if you go to court and you sue someone for damages, and to stop someone from continuing to defame you, and that you can also ask the court to order interdict. Now, it's not easy going to court. It can take years. It can be costly. You might be able to get your costs back at the end of the case, but all the other costs that you have put into it might not actually equal what you get out at the end. So it's always a bit of a hit and go thingy, but it might be useful as a deterrent effect. And there's various ways in which one would look at a defamation, but the main thing, it must be a statement that has been made in public, which insulted or defamed a person, and which as one of the criteria that it caused harm or injury, or has the potential to cause harm and injury against a group of people. So there's a few criteria for defamation. Normally, the way to get out of a defamation claim is for the other person to say, well, it was true, it was in the public interest. But again, that is not always the case. And I think hate speech, in a case of hate speech, that is quite a difficult defense. There was one case in Namibia dealing with hate speech in the High Court. And people, I don't know the case personally, so if anyone knows the case and want to speak more about it, you're welcome to do so later on. So the case basically related to a letter that was written in a newspaper where a person just started defaming a certain group in Namibia and accusing them of like a hidden agenda against other groups and all those sort of things. And the High Court held that the person who did publish that letter had that constituted defamatory remarks. It was done on Facebooks, and the court actually said that the manner in which the person published the letter in a newspaper and on Facebook fanned hate speech against a particular group. So this is a perfect example, really, of how one can think about also framing cases where there is specific hate speech targeted at groups. And this could include instances where politicians engage in hate speech, or where the media keeps on publishing opinions of people which constitute hate speech and has the risk of fanning hate against a particular group in society. There's also an offense of criminal defamation. So this offense exists under common law in Namibia. Ordinarily, it's not a great offense because it's often used against activists and against journalists. And people have said that it's disproportionate because unlike the civil defamation offense where you brought before a court, here you can actually end up in prison for what you had said. That doesn't mean that there aren't instances where people should end up in prison for what they had said, and I'll speak a bit about that later on. There's another offense in common law, which is the offense of public violence, where a person together with other persons commit acts intended to disturb public's peace and to invade the rights of others. So this would be a bit further than hate speech. It could be various types of hate crimes, but it's done with a hateful intent also. And sometimes even hate speech itself can fall under that, depending on how it is done. Then, Namibia has a Racial Discrimination Prohibition Act, which came into being immediately after independence. The act only speaks about inciting racial disharmony, so it doesn't speak about any other identity factor against which hate can be committed. So according to the act, you can't use any language or publish anything which threaten or insult any group or group of persons because they belong to a particular racial group, or that encourages or incites hatred between different racial groups or persons belonging to such groups, or that disseminates ideas based on racial superiority. Great act. Very few times that it has ever been used. I want to say almost never. So there is something for sometimes even having legislation in itself contributing to it being a deterrent. But it is also, again, it highlights the same thing which one might have when you do get a Combating of Hate Act, that unless one pushes for it to be enforced properly, And the first part of enforcement, because yeah, you don't have to enforce it, you should just know about it so that you can go to the police and lay a charge of inciting racial disharmony, but who knows about it? And I think so in the example, the civil case I mentioned earlier, one could have taken that same person who wrote the Facebook article and charge him at the police station for inciting racial disharmony, because that's what he did in his article. So I'm just raising that, but what one could suggest is that there should be a reviving of the combating of hate speech bill that the Ombuds has promoted some time back, or there should be a revision of laws to actually broaden, have acts similar to this. So, for example, Zambia has one on which prohibits all forms of gender discrimination and incitement against women. So you can think of ways in which South Africa has one which is much, much broader and includes any sort of incitement against any group. So this is good because this provision we should use as a way of combating hate as part of the campaign to combat any form of hate. But it's not enough because there are so many other forms of hate that isn't captured by this provision. Now, the other issue is hate crimes. So hate crimes would be normal, well, not normal crimes, but would be crimes that are committed, such as murder, rape, or common assault, or assault with the intent to do grievous bodily harm. But they do it done with because of bias and hatred. So they're called hate crimes when they are being done. Now, when a hate crime is committed, the person who commits it should be given an aggravated sentence. Now, in countries in our region, this is actually included. So the trick is that with Namibia, most of the crimes, and South Africa, the crimes are under common law. But in countries where the crimes are set out in the penal code, the penal code has actually set out a provision that says, for example, if rape was committed as a result of hate, then there should be an aggravated sentence for it. And the same goes for many other offenses. Now, you could easily put a provision like that in the Criminal Procedure Act in Namibia. And the Act already provides for some things, so it would just be adding a section or amending a section. So this could again be something one suggests to the legislature if they want to start amending easy stuff. And that would be a fairly easy thing that wouldn't necessarily be contradictory, and we can easily use examples from other countries in the region to show that it's actually pretty normal. So in Lesotho, for example, they have a whole range of identities where if one committed a crime and the crime was informed or motivated by hate against a whole group, then automatically you get a worse sentence. So I'm just putting that out there. And this would be if people commit hate crimes or crimes that is based on hostility towards the victim or motivated by hostility. Now, in the Criminal Procedure Act in Namibia, there's one provision that might be useful to look at. So often what's going to happen is if someone is charged, if someone committed a hate crime or hate speech, and somehow you manage to get them convicted or charged, well, convicted in court, in some instances, that conviction can actually fuel more hate. And the counter to that would be to think, how do we actually promote reconciliation? Depending, obviously, if it was a really terrible thing, then there shouldn't be, the person should be punished and sentenced. But sometimes you can combine that with other orders for compensation, for community service, for compulsory attendance of sensitization courses, or those sort of things. So we have to think about how we fix our society. And just locking everyone up who says something hateful isn't going to fix it. And it might make it worse. So it's just something to play with about how we also show compassion towards those who commit hate so that they can see that there is another way of dealing with things in the world. That's now theoretically, at least. Another good point in the Criminal Procedure Act, it allows the court to award compensation for offences which cause damage. Well, it's a bit limited to property, but I think one would want to make an argument in the future that it should be broader than that as well. But it could well be that there's instances where in South Africa, for example, xenophobic violence has often led to the shops of foreigners being burnt down. Now, if we had a provision like this in our Criminal Procedure Act, that would be useful to compensate the persons whose shops had been burnt down. So you see how sometimes these sort of provisions can be also useful to try and this how people had been victims of this sort of hate. Now, the big thing that we need to work on, in addition to fixing Namibia's laws, I would say, is to get the courts to take hate more seriously. So it was a good thing that there's a good provision, good quote in the Friedel de Saab judgment, that there was a judgment on defamation relating to hate speech. But we want the courts to consistently realize that any form of hate, whether it's hate speech or hate crimes, is not in the public interest, and it's to the detriment of our society, and it escalates fear and distrust amongst groups, which then leads to an escalation of crimes, which anyone who's ever been in South Africa would know things can get really hairy. So you do not want to go down that path. Well, I know it's hairy everywhere, but violence can really go out of control. There's ways in which the courts then can take hate more seriously. One would be developing sentencing guidelines. So you don't actually have to reform the law. You can develop a sentencing guidelines that says that judges must take crimes committed with hate more seriously when they impose a sentence. So you can list aggravating factors in a sentencing guideline, which sometimes, depending on the political situation, might be a bit easier than getting law reform on it. You could try law reform depending on the issue. And then the other thing is we could train judges and magistrates to just realize that they have the discretion, and you saw that in that one provision in the Criminal Procedure Act, they have the discretion to go beyond just sentencing someone, to imposing more severe sentences, but also to impose other things in addition to sentencing that would actually try and restore some of the harm that had been caused. And yes, my tongue twister, we must be consistently intolerant towards intolerance. And we have to make sure that that's the case with the judiciary, that that's the case with the police, and all over. And it does mean quite a bit of work with each of those bodies, but it's important. And it's very important in the current context, because what's happening at the moment globally is that there's a huge shift where previously the fringes, right-wing fringes in society, had always said that it's their right to promote hate. It falls within the right to freedom of speech. But now those right-wing people have become mainstream people in many countries throughout Europe and the US, and even throughout Africa. And this is very, very dangerous. And this is something we cannot allow to happen, because what is happening now is that those religious groups and evangelists and everyone else who propagate hate claim that if anyone says they should not propagate hate, we're infringing on their rights, and ach, shame, these poor people can't say anything. And then they end up being the victims. And we can't let that happen. There was one good case a week ago in the UK where a woman had, under the Public Order Act, been accused of inciting violence after she published a post on Facebook where she said that the hostels where refugees were staying must be burnt down. And when she was prosecuted, everyone in the UK who are conservative went into uproar, and they were so upset about how could anyone violate her right to freedom of expression, and the world is falling down, and it was also terrible. And then the Court of Appeal sentenced the woman to 3 years. And they said, well, actually, she knew exactly what she was doing. She knew that she could cause harm by saying what she said. And she didn't say it once, she said it a few times. So therefore, they had no problem with actually imposing a criminal sentence. Which takes me back to the point I made previously, that many people don't like the offense of criminal defamation because it imposes, can impose or lead to imprisonment. But in some cases where people engage in hate speech to the point where they incite violence against people, and that violence is likely to escalate, I think there is very much a basis for arguing that there should be imprisonment. So I'm just putting it out there. We mustn't be sidetracked by the right wing and the comment and their arguments about freedom of speech, because they are wrong about freedom of speech, but increasingly people are adopting their views on freedom of speech because they think that is what the right version is. And I want to give you a quote from Pope Francis, where he was actually making that same point, that he's seeing increasingly the narrative changing. And sometimes what people are saying is what Hitler said. Well, now Trump might even be worse than Hitler in some respects, but we cannot compromise. We cannot have things deteriorate to how they were before. I mean, Namibia has had a democracy only since 1990. We can't go back. And all we can do is in every little space about everything, we need to put our foot down. Just to note also that the African Commission has said that it's okay to prohibit speech where it promotes hatred and discrimination, which is why it's okay for us to push for combating of hate speech bill, but it's also okay for us to insist that what we have at the moment in our laws should be used to try and tackle hate speech. And finally, we must support free speech, condemn hate speech, and stick to it. That's all from me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Annika. Excuse me. That was very informative. I was kind of aware that we lacked legislation that could be useful to tackle hate speech, and now I'm speechless, to say the least. Just before I hand it over to Florence, who will then come in from a Namibian perspective, I just wanted to highlight that maybe this could be an opportunity for us as civil society and activists from different walks of life to consider doing submissions on the law reform. I know that the president has called on this, with the due date being in about, I think, a week's time, a week and a half, I think the 12th of June. So something just to consider, and for people to engage in the chat box on possible priorities when it comes to the law reform, as it relates to hate speech and similar crimes. I know Namibia is going through the most horrible time with crimes of hate against girls and women at the moment. So something that we should also focus on as a collective to get ahead of. The presentation will be shared, yes, at the end of the meeting. And I'm going to hand it over to Florence. Florence, please do take it away.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much, Annika, for the amazing presentation. Indeed, there's really so much happening in Namibia that is not being said, especially when it comes to the hate crimes that our communities are experiencing. And the sad part of it is people that have lost their lives to hate crimes are not here to testify. So there is this silence, this structural silencing that is really taking place. I would like to appreciate all the participants that are here on the Zoom. I would like to appreciate the Young Feminist Movement Namibia team from different parts of the country that are here. I would also like to appreciate our partner organizations such as Positive Vibes, Free to Be Movement, the university spaces, UArt with Kedirang. I would also like to appreciate people such as also Rachel, also Jolarina, all of you that are in the space. Also our international placement interns, Emma and Maria. Thank you for joining us into this amazing webinar. So for now, I would like to have us to have a conversation together just to see how is, hate speech and hate crime affecting us in the work that we are doing. And while I'm waiting for you all to maybe put up your hand, I will just start off with the Young Feminist Movement and how we are responding to hate speech within the different programmatic areas that we work in. One of which is the voice, which is very important to us as YFM, whereby we strengthen the voices of young women in their diversity to be able to be equipped with knowledge to speak out for themselves and really to become women human rights defenders, to use cross-movement strategies in order to work with duty barriers, communities, as well as their peers to discuss and have conversation around things that really concerns them. So we also have a group of young women that are creating safe spaces within their communities, working with young LBQ women, working with adolescent girls and young women to address the issues of sexual, gender-based violence, as well as, the hate crimes that, specifically LBQ women are facing within their communities. And then we also, through our alliances that we are part of, such as the Free to Be Me, such as the Diversity Alliance. We have also been doing quite a lot of work as a movement to really coordinate things that we need to prioritize as a movement and to see how by the LGBT movements, the sex workers movement, as well as the feminist movements can really come together and work across different movements to see how are we strategizing in terms of issues that are concerning us as a country. And I would say that, from 2023 to the current moment of 2025, it hasn't been easy for us as Namibia. Every single day we would read in the newspaper about how political leaders, would, speak about, igniting, hate among certain groups of people, which has been the LGBT people who have been, dominating the newspaper in terms of how people are not really understanding and how people are talking about how un-African being queer is, and that has been extended to the digital space, whereby every time you read an article that has been written by a newspaper, you would also be hearing a lot of hate crimes that are being said by ordinary citizens. So this has become a very critical issue in our country that really needs our collective actions, that needs us to work cross movements, different movements, to work, intersectionally to see how we are really coming together and prioritizing how we are responding to hate crimes that different communities are experiencing. And definitely, Daniel, as you said, we will definitely be, responding to the call of the president in terms of, highlighting, key issues that needs to be prioritized. So for now, I would like to give the floor over to everybody else. Let me just see who's on the chat. So Emma is saying, so sorry, I have to run out, go to an appointment. This is a very interesting conversation so far, and I can't wait to watch the recording. So definitely you can watch the recording on our social media pages. And then Patrick Star is saying, as a community facilitator and a young sports leader, one thing I have encountered and witnessed when working with young women and young girls is the limited space that we are given to freely practice our rights and our human rights, such as practicing, playing sports, coaching, learning, without being without there being an equal platform for women. Hate speech comes in different forms of you cannot lead a team because you are a woman. As a woman, you are not fit to run or to play. So your job is to stay at home and to provide. And definitely, those are some of the issues that, as young women, they are experiencing when they are taking up leadership, within their communities and really taking action by becoming leaders and, organizing through feminism within their community. We get to be called different kinds of names, and these are some of the realities that young feminists are facing when it comes to them doing activism work within their community. So definitely this is an issue that really concerns us, and this is something that we need to collectively find strategies to. So I would give the floor to anybody from Namibia that would like to share a little bit about their organization and the amazing work that they are doing in terms of, addressing the issue of hate crimes.
Thank you, Flo. If anyone can raise their hand so then you can unmute and speak on the issue. And also, I'm just going to add as we, sorry, I see a message from Rachel. Rachel, would you like to rather speak into the mic, perhaps, if that's possible? Okay, no, all good. I will read your comment to everyone. Communities, Rachel says, communities targeted by hate speech must reclaim their narratives through intersectional language that names not just the hate, but the layered systems that sustain it. By recognizing that race, gender, sexuality, class, ability, and other identities do not exist in isolation, communities can expose how hate speech operates at the intersections, dehumanizing queer migrants, criminalizing poor Black youth, erasing disabled Indigenous voices. Intersectional language empowers communities to articulate these complex realities, hold multiple systems accountable at once, and build coalitions that do not compete for justice but demand it together. It shifts the conversation from individual harm to structural violence, making the invisible visible and creating room for solidarity that is both deep and transformative. Rachel, I must say, I do. Oh, no, no worries. It's fine. I can still read your comments, Rachel. Rachel is in a loud space. I do agree with your point. I think it is quite important to really work as a collective instead of working in silos and focusing on little issues, like the issues that I mentioned earlier of young girls and women going through abuse and atrocious crimes, really, in the recent days in Namibia. It's an issue that as a civil society need to look at collectively and fight with the women, with the young girls, with organizations like YFAM to show a collective front. Because if we do work and in scattered silos, often that doesn't quite help a lot. I wanted to also raise a concern on the a piece of legislation that came in Annika's presentation, and that was the inciting racial disharmony, and how I've never, number one, I've never known that it existed, and I'm quite shocked that it hasn't been used given the society that we exist in Namibia. I know Namibia is good, but I can't see that inciting racial disharmony is a piece of legislation that was never used. I was very shocked to know of its existence, and maybe that's the reason why, is because we don't know what laws exist out there, what we can use when we experience certain violations in our lives. So that was very good to know, and I think it's something we can carry forward and raise awareness around, so that people know of the existence of this law. So thank you, Annika, for sharing that. If anyone else would like to raise a hand, you can give suggestions. I know I'm going to keep going back to this law reform because I think it's very important. And I know there was a lot of people that were interested in the process of law reform that was announced by Madam President. So if anyone has oh, Anna, I see your hand.
Hi, Danny. Okay, this is just maybe a point of discussion. I know there has been, we've had this discussion before, and I just want maybe Anneke to shed a little light on this discussion. I know there has been quite a lot of what we assume. I say assume because evidence and all is hate crimes where trans women in rural areas were murdered, maimed and injured, and we've had individuals, talking about how they get jeered at in public. We've had politicians who have actually made hateful, I would say, statements in parliament and outside, even in the media. We have, media practitioners who have written very flaming articles around LGBT. I guess my question is, I don't know if it's a question, but the point that I would like us to discuss, not to put you in the spot, Anneke, I know you, this is not like a legal analysis that is aiming to take a hate speech um, matter to court, but are we because I'm quite depressed right now. My thinking has always been, we would be able to do something in Namibia. Are we saying that it can be very difficult or impossible to do, not because there is no evidence, but because of the law itself? Just, yeah.
Thanks, Adam. We're not saying that we must do stuff. I want to put in the.
Thank you.
I want to put now, even though under the West law one can do stuff. I'm putting back the Kwalani quote about what hate speech is, because I note earlier on there were comments about sometimes there are acts of, so if someone doesn't allow you to do something, that might be a form of discrimination, but it might not necessarily constitute hate speech if they just tell you face to face. But if they start telling a lot of other people in an open space in a way that encourages violence towards you, that then becomes hate speech. So if we want to act on hate speech specifically, I think we have to choose cases that are very clear, because sometimes one can take up a case on the basis that it's discriminatory. You don't necessarily have to make the hate speech argument. So many of the arguments that were raised about sort of women not being allowed to take part in sports, that's discrimination, and one can take it up for sure. The And I think Rachel was right that often we shouldn't get sidetracked by the language, and we should think about raising everything as much as we can. So Anna, to your point, on the example I gave of civil defamation where the person wrote something on Facebook against a group, there's no basis on which we can't do the same if a religious leader or a politician does the same thing publicly. They have some immunity when they do things within Parliament, but once they're out there and they put it on to the media and the media then broadcasts it, we have a basis to go after for civil defamation, to go after both the politician or the religious leader and the media if they tend to propagate it then further. That would be sort of a civil defamation type claim thingy that could ask that they desist from doing that again. Sometimes, just on an easier note, sometimes you can just send threatening letters to people also. So as a lawyer, I've often sent letters to people saying, like, if someone says my neighbor keeps on saying stuff about me, then I just write a letter to the neighbor with a legal letterhead and say, dear, so madam, we've come to our attention that you engage in XYZ. Kindly note that this is unlawful, and should you continue to do so, we will assist our client to pursue further legal remedies. So there is sometimes people get a bit of a freak out when they get a letter like that, and they would actually rethink or calm down a bit. But so in terms of all the hate crimes that has been happening in Namibia, I definitely think that when those cases are, that first it's important that we make sure that those cases are prosecuted, and when they are prosecuted before the courts, and we have to campaign on it if they're not prosecuted, and we have to speak to station commanders and the director of public prosecutions and go further up if we see that there's problems in dealing with such cases. And that could be meetings or writing letters or any of those things. So we want to push it forward, and we don't want it to be delayed. That's the one thing, because delaying it also shows a lack of seriousness from the court side about cases of hate crimes. And then the second thing would be to then have a meeting with the prosecutor and speak with the prosecutor about the need to ask to bring the issue that it was a hate crime both into the evidence that is led during the trial, and also the evidence that's led when the person is convicted, to ask for a mitigation and sorry, to ask for aggravated sentence. So definitely there's a lot we can do, and don't ever give up, because one can do anything.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Annika. Excuse my voice. I am coming down with something, I think. Yeah, you raise very, very important points there. I guess as I'm waiting for people to start chipping in, because this is the Namibian context, and I know that there are a lot of pressing issues in Namibia. So I'm gonna wait. Yeah, Annika says in the chat you can raise those issues with the Ombud or the LAC. Okay. Okay. You can also ask organizations like LAC to write legal cease and desist letters. Okay, thank you so much, Annika. So I've got a follow-up question. I do not mean to put you on the spot again, but you are sort of the expert here as I wait for the Namibians to come and chip in. So you did mention that there was a piece of legislation on public order in your presentation. I know a lot of, especially, this is definitely not a trans webinar, but especially the trans community, because they did go through the worst backlash in the previous few years, would experience things like, yes, hate speech and people calling derogatory terms in a public space. And I suppose that could be grounds to sort of take the matter to the police or to court ultimately. But the tricky part, maybe this is a question, maybe it's not. The tricky part is if you cannot identify whom among the crowd, what could one then do? What are other sort of avenues one could pursue in that instance?
I think our best case would be is if we target the person who was convening the crowd. And if that person made a statement, if statements are made randomly in a crowd, so say the political party is organizing a meeting and suddenly people at the back shout, kill the gays,
Yeah.
It's hard to blame the political party, but there are certain instances where the conveners of a meeting can be held liable. But you also want to then, if it's someone who's in front saying it, then that's easy. Then we have a person we can target and take to court. If the person in front doesn't stop the people at the back from saying what they're saying, that could also be a basis for taking them to court. It's not always easy, and you can't do it months later. So I think you want to act as soon as one can. Take the issue to the media, because then at least it starts being on paper. You can write to whoever organized the meeting and voice your displeasure if you didn't intend to, if you don't want to go the legal route. Then there's other ways. Set up a meeting saying, can you give us a guarantee that in future you're going to tell your members to stop engaging in hate speech? And if they say no, then we go to the media and expose them for not doing that. So, like, think creatively about what can, and it's different for every different thing. So if that happens, say at a taxi rank, then you would want to speak to the organizers of that taxi rank. Ask them if they would work with your organization and with the Ombud to engage in a campaign, perhaps with poster campaign on hate speech. Put up a big billboard outside the taxi rank saying, we say no to hate. Any hate is going to destroy our society. Like whatever you can think of that's going to make people think. And that's going to create the conversation and open up the conversation, and never link hate speech to freedom of speech, because it complicates things. It's not the same thing. And people should never be allowed to say hateful things, but a lot of it is in the conversation. And I think it's important to have conversations with organizers, with political parties. You can even be, okay, you just had your election, but you can do it at, like, if there's other elections or by-elections coming up, you can ask every political party, what's your position on hate speech? What are you going to do to limit hate speech in the country? Like make people aware that it's an issue for the community. And you don't just do it as like one organization. You get people from refugee organizations, people from disability organizations, women's rights organizations, all of them write similar letters to all the political parties. You can even do templates if you needed to, so that people see this as an issue. And so even when we submit stuff about the laws we want reformed, we should get everyone from a whole range of groups to say we want combating of hate speech bill. Because they need to see this is not one group that's just got a bee in its bonnet and we can't give it to that group because it's controversial. They must see it as everyone in society wants it. You even get churches to come write that they don't want the hate speech, combating of hate speech bill. Like there's many bases on which one can do it. So just don't give up. So Rachel, your point about MPs. So there's a they call it like an immunity. So if you voice your opinion in Parliament, you cannot be prosecuted for it. That doesn't mean that your political party cannot hold you to account. So one can still write to the political party and say that out, we are horrified to see that your members of Parliament promotes hate. And we ask you to urgently address this because we do not want that sort of society. So I think often acting outside of the legal framework might be easier, but you can put bits of the legal framework in your letter if need be. There's not that much you can put in for Namibia in it, but I think there's broader arguments we can make. Also remember that international law is automatically binding in Namibia. So that means that you can quote from the African Commission or from the other sort of guidelines that has been set internationally around issues of hate speech to make your point as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Annika. Flo, I think we have a few comments in the chat if you would like to go through those.
Yes, let's see. So there was a comment by Osi Mercedes that I saw earlier. Let me just try to find it. Okay, so Mercedes was saying, in the absence of taking the legal route through the court system, which is usually a lengthy and drawn out process, and also not accessible for everyone, especially for trans women, in the office of the ombudsman's a possible avenue to hold state actors such as the politicians and the police or the media account. It's a question that was given by Mercedes. And then Annika responded, yes, you can raise issues with the ombudsman. You can also ask organizations such as the LAC to write legal letters. So that's what we were just discussing right now. And then Madam J said, it's a very interesting conversation, but I have to run because she's traveling. So yes, so those are just some of the chats that I was able to see now.
Okay, thank you so much. You wanted
Okay.
to say something?
No, I just want to say that this the conversation has been really interesting, and it gives us a lot of opportunity as the Namibian movements in our diversity to take on this action when it comes to hate crimes. And I think that, you know, especially from a young feminist movement perspective, we will definitely be engaging some of our partner organizations to see how we can collectively take action, and also reach out to our non-partner organizations such as various churches, you know, traditional authorities, just to start the conversation, because, you know, it might not all happen in a day, but, you know, we have to start somewhere, and, you know, movement building takes time. So definitely we have to start somewhere and really to engage our various partners, especially when it comes to access to information, which is really important, because disinformation and misinformation is one of those issues that we are facing in Namibia. You know, with the rise of AI, we can see a lot of people are using social media platforms such as WhatsApp and Facebook, but for generating videos and, you know, coming up with false information using the letterheads of the newspapers to spread hate and so forth. So there's just so much work that we need to do, and we need to really, you know, coordinate ourselves as a movement to see how are we really holding our governments accountable to really protect all the individuals in the country.
Yes, thank you, Osi Flo. If there's anyone who would like to speak, now would be the time. And if there is a lack of any more additional comments, then I think we are nearing closing this webinar. I do, however, would like to, with the fear of sounding like a broken record, I do agree on showing up intersectionally, on showing up as a collective, on focusing on things that actually do affect all of us, not just one group, because we are often so set against one another, especially by politics, that we lose sense of where we're going. I'm going to raise this again, inciting racial disharmony. We live in communities, we live in rural communities, we work with diverse group of people. I fail to see that there hasn't been any issues that would require this piece of legislation to actually be used in our work. So something just to consider. And then number two, we are available if anyone would like to raise any priorities when it comes to the law reform, particularly the one that was called upon by the president. If you have any sort of lists of laws that you would like to look into, we are able to support. We can do these kind of meetings that are online to go through different laws that might be useful if they were reformed, or if you like Anika mentioned the combating of hate speech bill from the Ombud. I think that could be another one to take on to the submissions for legal reform. Excuse me. But I would like to extend my gratitude to everyone who has shown up today. And I know it is a week off, so it's tricky in Namibia to attend online meetings, but I appreciate people who have made the time to attend this, and we hope to continue having this conversation. We hope to have a follow-up on this particular conversation, because I do think that more and more of us could benefit from this kind of webinars. We will have a questionnaire out. So if you were not registered, please do drop in your email in the chat box. If you were registered, we should have your email on record. So we will follow up with you with the questionnaire. If you would like a certificate, that is, then you can just take part in our questionnaire. Like more conversations like this need to happen. We need to have conversations where police are a part, where media is also engaging with us, because someone did mention that sometimes the media tend to sensationalize issues. On their part, they might be trying to help with the visibility, but then maybe the approach could be completely wrong. So I think it's a very, very important conversation, because if we have our conversation on this corner and then they are not a part, they miss what the need is within the communities. So if there is nothing else, I will invite Florence to do some closing remarks. But yeah, thank you so much for being with us. Florence? I think we lost Florence. Let me check. Okay. Okay, I think we lost Florence, but on that note, then I think it is fair to end it here. Thank you again for being a part of this on this beautiful Tuesday afternoon. I hope you write to us. I hope you are able to attend the next convening that we have, albeit online. It's always great to hear from everybody. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.